Why were Marx's writings, the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, which he wrote in Paris in the summer of 1844, why were these writings kept hidden from the public view for almost 100 years? Why did Marx never acknowledge them, never publish them, never refer to them in his later writing? Before these manuscripts of the young Marx were discovered and made available, Marxism had been thought of primarily in terms of the work of the mature Marx, and as being a scientific system, or as scientific socialism, as Marx and Engels themselves called it, or as an economic and materialistic interpretation of history, which stood Hegel's idealistic interpretation of history on its head. Generations of Marx scholars accepted the view that for Marx the meaning of history is found in class struggle, in class conflict, and the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. As a scientific theory, Marxism was regarded as having no moral or religious or philosophical meaning, but simply as offering a scientific explanation of the economic laws governing historical change. But when the economic and philosophical manuscripts were discovered and became known by the middle of the 20th century, a new view of Marx emerged from the study of these manuscripts, a view of Marxism as a moral or even a religious system of thought, which has as its fundamental theme the moral regeneration, the moral rebirth of humanity through world revolution. This is taken to be the meaning of the newly discovered system of the young Marx, for whom the burning issue is human alienation and its overcoming by a world revolution. Are there then two Marxist systems? Are there two Marxist views of the significance of history? Is world history the process in which human self-alienation is finally overcome and human beings realize themselves through revolution and appropriate their true essence as creative, wise, and free? Or is the history of the world the scientific history of class conflict and its ending by the classless society of communism? Does world history have a humanistic goal of human self-fulfillment and rebirth, as the 1844 Paris manuscripts indicate, or does it have a scientifically explained economic goal, as the writings of the mature Marx proclaim? Or is it possible to find a reconciliation of the humanistic and the scientific viewpoints in the thought of Marx, and to show how they may come together in his own understanding of his system? To raise these questions is to penetrate into Marxism below the usual surface accounts which summarize the main arguments of the late Marx. Let us turn to the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, the Paris manuscripts of 1844, as they are usually called. Here we see the developing importance of economics for Marx. Marx in Paris had been voraciously, hungrily reading Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and other major economic theorists in his attempt to understand the Industrial Revolution, its present disastrous impact on human life, and what its future course might be. The importance of economics in human history had already been established in Marx's thinking by Hegel, by Hegel's powerful analysis of civil society, in which Hegel had said that the economic relations of civil society constitute a battlefield where everybody's individual private interests meet everybody else's. To Hegel, civil society and its economic affairs is a war of all against all. It is the continuous conflict of egoistic desires. Hegel's picture of the competitive evils of civil society, with its accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, and poverty and alienation for the masses, was now reinforced in Marx's mind by the descriptions which he read from the French socialists about the miserable lives of industrial workers. Marx himself began to develop his own thoughts on economic life in civil society. in an essay which he entitled The Jewish Question. Marx here speaks of economic alienation, of human beings estranged or alienated from the world of commerce in which money is the god. The modern commercial world, says Marx, is a religion of money worship, and he identifies this as Judaism. The Jews, he points out, are no longer a religious or a racial group. They have been forced into money lending and into the competitiveness of economics by society. As a result, says Marx, in his own words, money is the jealous one God of Israel, beside which no other God may stand. Money dethrones all the gods of man and turns them into a commodity. Money is the universal, independently constituted value of all things. It has therefore deprived the whole world, both the world of man and of nature, of its own value. Money is the alienated essence of man's work and of his being. This alien being, this money, rules over him and he worships it. Christianity, Marx says, has now taken over this money worship, this alienation of man from himself in the worship of money. On the question, therefore, of emancipating the Jews from laws which discriminate against them, Marx argues that the only way to deal with the Jewish question is to recognize that it is also the Christian question, and to emancipate both Christians and Jews from the worship of money, and thus from their economic alienation. Both Christians and Jews, he says, live in economic alienation as men producing objects which assume the alien form of money and become an alien power over them. Marx seems to have been uncertain of how to proceed at this point. The concept which was dominant with him was that of economic alienation. In the manuscript of 1844, Marx's powerful concentration upon economics produced a great new insight which swept him back into the orbit of Hegel. In the manuscript entitled Criticism of the Hegelian Dialectic and Philosophy as a Whole, there appears the insight on Marx's part that Hegel's phenomenology of spirit was in its underlying meaning a philosophy of economic life and economic interpretation of history, where Hegel talks about the externalization of spirit, of the absolute, estranged from itself, alienating itself in human consciousness. He was really speaking in a confused way, not of spirit's self-externalization and self-alienation in human consciousness, but really of man externalizing himself in material objects, of man's self-alienation in the objects which he produces. The underlying hidden meaning of the Hegelian philosophy, Marx discovers, is economics. Hegel, turned upside down, provides a study of man's alienation from the products of his own labor in the money economy of capitalism. And did not Hegel, in the famous chapter on master and slave in the Phenomenology of Spirit, show that the slave's production of the object appears to him to be an external and alien object, but that the slave overcomes the externalization and alienation of the products of his labor, and he recognizes his own essence in the objects he has made, discovers his freedom in his objectification of himself. The slave reappropriates himself from what had been the externalized, alienated products of his labor. Moreover, now that Marx has the key to the real underlying meaning and truth of Hegelian philosophy, Marx takes Hegel's phenomenology of spirit as the model for his own construction of an account of the self-realization of economic man, of labor. The true meaning of history is that it is the developmental process in which man, generic man, laborer, producer, creator of material and non-material objects, achieves self-realization and repossesses his own essence from the objects he has produced. And Marx, however, criticizes Hegel for his idealism, which sees the essence of man as spirit and sees alienation only as the alienation of consciousness or of spirit. But mankind, says Marx, is a natural being, not merely spirit, and mankind develops in the course of world history. He has powers, this man, faculties, desires, creative abilities, which have their outcome in production. Man is a creative being. Mankind in its history, says Marx, has transformed the objects of the entire material world, and he has created the entire world of culture. The vast historical and natural accumulation of the material and cultural objects that mankind has produced are the externalizations, the embodiments of man's creative powers. Man actualizes himself in the world. In Marx's own powerful language, the whole so-called world history is nothing other than the production of man himself through human labor. It is Marx's view, which he will never give up, that the history of human beings is the developing process in which they have created the entire world of objects of nature and of human culture. And in this developing process, human beings will come to realize their own true nature. But the human species does not realize that it is the creator of the world of natural objects and of the totality of culture. For example, the whole of modern industry is man's product. Machines and factories are the externalizations of human hands, ears, eyes, brains. But what man sees when he looks at the objects he has produced are alien things in an alien, hostile world, standing out there over against him. This is so because man's productive activity is done in servitude to the god money, rather than in spontaneous self-activity and self-determination. Human alienation takes three main forms, according to Marx, in the 1844 Paris manuscripts. First, man is alienated from the product of his work. Second, from the act of producing. And third, from his own social nature. First, the worker in industrial capitalism is alienated from his product, which exists external to him, is utilized by strangers as their private property. And the more he produces of them, the less is his productivity valued. He becomes cheaper than the cheap commodities he produces, and his work and his wages for his work are just sufficient to what is necessary to keep him working. Secondly, the capitalist system alienates man from his productive activity. His activity is not determined by his personal benefit or by his own creativity, but is something which he is compelled to do in order to remain alive. As a result, says Marx, the worker only feels himself outside his work, and in his work he feels outside himself. His labor is forced labor. The more he works, the less human he becomes. He finally feels at home only in the animalian functions of eating, drinking, and sexuality. And thirdly, capitalist society alienates the worker from his fellow man. Unlike animals, says Marx, who produce food only for their own immediate needs, humans produce cultural products, such as art and science, for the whole human race. Humans produce as universal beings. But the capitalist system reduces man's productivity to animal labor, to a mere means to satisfy his immediate physical needs. But the worker, too, is in bondage to greed, is a slave before the master money, the money god of capitalism. Capitalists advise him to save his money and invest it. As Marx says in the Paris manuscripts, this is the advice they get. The less you eat, drink, and read books, the less you go to the theater, the dance hall, the public house, the less you think, love, theorize, sing, paint, the more you save, the greater becomes your treasure, which neither moths nor dust will devour, your capital. The less you are, the more you have. Hegel had identified human passion as the prime motivating force in the human world. But Marx identifies this force as the passion of greed for money in capitalist society. To Marx, greed has been the motivating force throughout all of human history, alienating man from himself and dehumanizing him. Man worships money as the all-powerful master. And now Marx moves on to the final and inevitable question. How can economic alienation be overcome? How can man reappropriate from the objects which he has created his own essence? And the more fundamental question, how can man's self be regained? The entire world is distorted by alienation. Alienation infiltrates and pervades every aspect of human life, says Marx: politics, law, the family, morality, religion, and economics. Alienation is the most important single character of man's life in human history. Man, the producer, has created a world of infinite objects and has lost himself in the process. Unlike Hegel's man, finite spirit, who in the course of history is continually progressing in consciousness of his own freedom, Marx's man, natural man, the producer, progresses in consciousness, but not of freedom, but of slavery, suffering, and exploitation. The law of his life is of constantly increasing alienation, says Marx, a law of increasing misery. For Marx, the only way for man to overcome self-alienation, to change himself, to free himself from the money mania, is to carry out a world revolution, a worldwide violent action, which will seize the world of private property from the capitalists and appropriate all the material objects which humans have created throughout history. After a brief stage of raw communism has passed, there will come about the time of ultimate communism, which Marx also calls the humanization of mankind. Man will repossess the lost world of created objects and will regain his enslaved powers. Labor itself will be abolished, and in its place there will be free, joyous, spontaneous, productive activity. And the end of economic alienation will also mean the abolition of all the other human relationships in which man has lived a life of alienation in history. There will be an end to the state, to the family, to all law and morality. All of these institutions, in Marx's view, are forms of human slavery. Man will repossess, reappropriate, regain himself from alienation in these institutions, and he will live in unity with his fellow man and with nature in the communist world to come. These were the principal ideas of the hastily written, disjointed Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts which Marx wrote in the summer of 1844. That summer, Jenny had returned home to Trier with her baby, where she had visited her mother and Marx's mother, both now widowed. Jenny had already begun a lifelong pattern of ill health, which was in part perhaps a response to the tensions, crises, and the grinding poverty of her life with Marx. Highly intelligent as Jenny was, she accepted but was troubled by the limited possibilities for self-development which were available to women in her day. But she served her husband faithfully and devotedly as his secretary, copying his manuscripts, handling his correspondence, and she, in fact, became knowledgeable in the sphere of radical philosophy and politics. A recent study of Jenny offers evidence that she is the actual author of several essays which had been credited to Marx. When Jenny returned to Paris in September of 1844, she discovered that Marx had established a friendship with Friedrich Engels, a friendship so stable and unwavering that it soon became a legend in its own time. Both Marx and Engels had much in common. They were almost the same age. Engels was 2 years younger. They came from upper-class homes. They both wrote poetry. They both became involved with the young Hegelian brand of radicalism. And they both moved on from that to communism and radical politics. But their intellectual styles and their lifestyles were very different. Marx was the speculative, creative, synthesizing type of mind, while Engels was practical and empirical. Marx was a family man. Engels was a womanizer and never married. Engels was the son of a Protestant family of wealthy cotton mill owners in the German Rhineland, and his lifelong career was in his family's business, and his interests were primarily in economics. During a year of his military service in Berlin, Engels came to know the radical young Hegelians at the University of Berlin. He soon became radicalized by them and wrote essays for radical journals such as Marx and Ruge's German-French Annals, and he also began to gather data for what was to be his, Engels's, finest work, The Situation of the Working Class in England, which was a bitter indictment of the early stages of capitalism. Engels had spent a year in England working at the Manchester branch in England of his father's firm, and on his way back to Germany, he stopped off in Paris, where on August 28, 1844, in a famous Paris cafe, he met Marx and began a conversation which ran on for 10 days, during which they decided to collaborate on a radical pamphlet which turned to be a 300-page book called The Holy Family. Before this book was finished, Marx was expelled from Paris and moved to Brussels. Engels soon moved into the house next door, and Marx and Engels began to work in September 1845 upon a criticism of the young Hegelians, which was to become their important work entitled The German Ideology. What is significant about the book The German Ideology of 1846 is the intellectual break between it and the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. Here in the German Ideology, so soon after the 1844 manuscripts, there appears the first formulation of the so-called Mature Marxism, in which the theory of self-alienated man, which had been the central theme of the 1844 manuscripts, is now shrugged off as a conception of the philosophers, and presumably as having no value. Missing from the German ideology are the idea of the self, the objectification of the human essence in objects produced, the working man's alienation from himself, world history as a loss of self, and ultimate self regained. In place of the self and the humanistic concern of the 1844 manuscripts with self-realization, mature Marxism in the German ideology speaks about societies, labor versus capital, proletariat versus bourgeoisie. It speaks about relations and forces of production. It speaks about an economic base and an ideological superstructure. These are all words from the familiar language of mature, conventional Marxism. They appear to represent the impersonal scientific vocabulary of the social sciences. Why did Marx make this fundamental shift from the humanistic focus upon the self to the impersonal scientific focus upon economic relationships? Are there two Marxisms, that of the 1844 manuscripts and that of the later scientific socialism of the German ideology, or can they be reconciled? First, in answer to the question, why this switch, several suggestions can be offered as to why Marx made the dramatic switch from understanding human life in terms of the alienation or conflict within the self to understanding it in terms of external, economic, class conflict. The taking of this step may have represented to Marx gaining the objectivity and the great prestige of social science for his theory. A second suggestion is the role of Engels. Engels had an impressive knowledge of the economics of industrial capitalism, and Engels had made the claim that once an economic system is operative, it is beyond human control. These may have influenced Marx toward economic explanation rather than philosophical explanation. And a third answer, the futility of the idealistic, philosophical, humanistic, young Hegelian movement, and the failure of this philosophic movement either to interpret or to change the world may have led Marx to turn to a scientific perspective instead. Two other explanations are psychological in nature. First, the growing personal maturity of Marx may have permitted him now to identify with his father's Enlightenment ideals of science and scientific objectivity, and to obey at last his father's constant urging him that, Karl, give up your fanciful young Hegelian speculations and become more prosaic, come down to earth. And a final explanation. In Marx's reference to in the German Ideology, to settling accounts with Hegelian philosophy, Marx appears to be switching to economics in order to establish at last his own separation and independence from the domination over himself of Hegelian philosophy, specifically of Hegel's humanistic account of finite spirit in the phenomenology of spirit. These are possible explanations of Marx's shift. There remains the need to answer the second question. Are there then two Marxisms, that of the young and of the mature Marx? And if so, can they be reconciled? What we have found is that the scenario of world history presented by the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844 is that of economic man's alienation from the products he has himself created, and that of regaining himself through a world revolution. This scenario is revised in the writings of the mature Marx. Beginning with the German Ideology, there is a new scenario of world history as class struggle and its overcoming by the revolution of the proletarian class and the ultimate advent of a class-less society. The scientific scenario, for the most part, eliminates the idea of the self, alienation, the drama of the loss of self and self-regained. And the new scientific scenario uses instead the impersonal concepts of labor, capital, economic production. Nevertheless, the scientific scenario of world history will continue to be expressive of the themes of alienation, conflict, revolution that produces human deliverance and salvation. Marx will use the impersonal concepts of the scientific scenario in such a way that the themes of the alienated man scenario will still be expressed. There are not two Marxisms then, but only one, which evolves from the conflict within alienated man to the conflict of economic classes. And the secretiveness of Marx, Engels, and Soviet officialdom with regard to the 1844 manuscripts is clearly the result of their embarrassment concerning revealing the philosophical, non-scientific, humanistic, and subjective roots of Marxism. We turn next time to the powerful works of the mature Marx.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.